When we picture a classic Viking warrior, what springs to mind? The patterned round shield, the bearded axe, and probably a cool Viking helmet without horns, of course. Also being arrayed in a shield wall formation with his fellow comrades fighting in the shield wall. But what doesn't really spring to mind are horses and cavalry when it comes to the Vikings. This is in contrast to other cultures of the early Middle Ages like the Franks and of course the Normans, who are famous for their equine abilities and their cavalry on the battlefield. So in this video I want to explore, did the Vikings have cavalry? If so, what form did they take? And if not, why not? Before diving into today's huge topic, I'd love to introduce you to a new sponsor for the channel, which is History Hit. Now, History Hit is great because it brings you the stories that shaped the world with an award-winning podcast network and online history channel. There are literally hundreds of programs, over 1,000 podcast episodes for on the go, and 5,000 history-related travel articles. Each week there are 15 new podcast episodes launched and 2 new programs. I've used the Bayeux Tapestry as evidence in this video about Viking cavalry, and you can do the same by finding out a bit more in the documentary called Uncovering the Bayeux Tapestry on History Hit. Dan Snow's History Hit continues to be the world's leading history podcast, but there are now 4 more podcasts covering the ancients, warfare, my personal favourite called Gone Medieval, and not just the Tudors, hosted by Susanna Lipsko. And now, for my fans, you'll get a 50% off your first 3 months when you use the code HISTORYWITHHILBERT as shown on the screen. So definitely check out History Hit because I'm really excited to be doing some stuff with them in the future as well. Let's start by taking a look at some of the Old Norse words relating to horses. One of the most common words for horse in Old Norse was hester, which is still seen in most of the modern Scandinavian languages. For example, in Norwegian, it is hest. There's also another word that comes up, which is hross, which in Old Norse is cognate to modern English horse, and indeed to Old English horsa as well, from a Proto-Germanic root. And still today we see an even closer form in hross that hasn't had the R metathesis of the R switching place with the H there. There are also some more poetic words like jur, which comes up in Old Norse, and faukur, both of which are found more in poetic contexts like steed or stallion rather than in a more prose context for their words. There is also, of course, a very famous Old Norse word or name for a specific horse, Sleipnir, which is the 8-legged horse of the god Odin and is related to probably the English word slippy or to slip, which is quite interesting that horses also play a role in the mythology of the Vikings as well as practically in their everyday lives. The Valkyries, these mythological battle maidens who are said to take the fallen warriors away to Odin's hall of Valhutl, are also sometimes described as riding a particular kind of horse. We read, for example, in the Eddic poem of Helga Kvíða Hjörvarðarsonar that Þrennar njundir meia, þó reith ein fyrir hvít und hjálmi meir, marir hrytusk, stóð af mónum þeirra dög í djöpa dalle, hagel í háva viðu, þaðan kemur mið oldum ár, allt var meir that leit, ek leit, which translates approximately to 3 times 9 girls, but 1 girl rode ahead. White-skinned under her helmet, the horses were trembling. From their manes dew fell into the deep valleys, hail in the high woods. Good fortune comes to men from there. All that I saw was hateful to me. You'll note here that they are riding on horses, but they aren't particularly fighting on horses, which is a distinction that will be important for the rest of this video. Outside of mythology and in the world of actual historic Norse people, horses were seen as status symbols that were owned by wealthier farmers, earls, and kings. If you think about it, a horse actually costs a lot of fodder to keep it going, especially if you're riding and using it as well. And unlike other animals like sheep, for example, you can't get wool from horses, nor are they being slaughtered, as frequently the pregnancy times of a horse is also a lot longer than other animals, and you aren't normally milking a horse with which you can make cheese or butter and things like that. So for the poorer farmer, horses weren't really an option, and so they were quite a high status symbol. They were also used for entertainment in the Viking world, and there is actually an Old Norse word which is hestavig, which basically translates to horse fight, and horse fighting was especially popular, we read in the sagas, for example, in Iceland. Now on Iceland as well, there are also a lot of burials. Almost all the high status burials there are accompanied with horses, so it's believed that horse riding was therefore a popular pastime among the wealthier people who were buried in these graves, and who would in the afterlife, in whatever form that would take, also be needing their horses there with them alongside treasures and servants and that kind of thing. For example, at the Oseberg burial found in Norway, the skeletal remains of some 14 horses were discovered. Horse meat was also important for pagan practice, and we read in later sagas that King Haakon the Good, a Christian king of Norway, refused to eat the horse meat, but that it was seen as an especially important ritual for the king to take part in. Later Christian laws also expressly forbade the consumption of horse meat. We know a little bit about how horses were viewed in Norse culture, but what about their use in warfare? Well, of course, when we're talking about the Vikings, we're really talking about raiders, to go Viking. And of course, for raiders, the most important form of transport was the longship, known in Old Norse as the drakar. Now, the thing with the drakar is that they're normally very narrow boats, and there isn't an awful lot of space on board. This makes them incredibly streamlined and incredibly quick, but it makes it rather difficult to transport horses, and in actual fact, almost impossible to transport horses, at least on the drakar type of ship. The Norse also had other types of ship, like the knar, which had a larger hold, which did allow for the transport of cattle and of horses, as we read in later sagas. But these were a bit slower, and they weren't generally the ships being used by raiding parties, and so we can fairly safely say that these were hit-and-run attacks rather than hit-and-ride attacks. However, this may not be the full story, as just because it was rather inconvenient for Viking raiders to take horses with them didn't mean that they actually ended up using horses on their raids. For example, in 865, when the Great Heathen army arrived in England, they arrived in East Anglia first, and instead of plundering the place, they came to an agreement with the king of East Anglia, called Edmund, that he would give them horses, and with these horses they then galloped up north to Northumbria, where they attacked York and then toppled that kingdom. And we have similar accounts on the continent, where Viking raiding armies would steal or barter for horses and then use these horses to make their way inland before setting off again on their longships. And indeed at Wareham, which is one of the camps of the Great Heathen Army in England, we do find bits of riding tackle and stirrups, which suggest that they were indeed using horses and had horses stationed at these camps. One of the most important references to horses in early medieval literature, particularly as it pertains to England, is the Old English poem of the Battle of Maldon. And in this poem, one of the first lines we read is Het the husachwenna hors forleten, feora fisan and forthgangan, hijan to handum and to hie godum, which translates to, then Burchnoth, who is the commander of the Anglo-Saxon forces, ordered each of his warriors to release their horses, to hurry them far away and to go forwards, mindful of their hands and their stout courage. Now, you'll note that Burchnoth, and this is actually describing the Anglo-Saxons rather than the Vikings, but the Vikings that they are attacking across this stream are not described as having any horses at all. And that really does make sense because, of course, for the Vikings, mobility was their key weapon of surprise. And the way that they were most mobile was with their longships. And so it's perhaps no surprise that they wouldn't really be using horses unless they needed to cut across large areas of land, like, for example, the Great Heathen Army was doing to get to Northumbria. But again, the passage in Maldon is interesting because it says something of the fighting style at the time, that people did know how to ride horses and would ride them to a battle and would then get off them to fight. And this is often assumed for how the Vikings fought as well, that they would perhaps ride to a battle as they did to York, and then they would dismount and fight themselves. Now, horses may be used as pack animals, particularly after a successful raid and possibly with an army as well. They could be very useful for transporting goods across land, probably to a longship, and then to load it into the longship, the treasure that they'd got, and then to sail back home. So it's possible that many of the horse finds we get, rather than being people fighting on horseback, that there were horses with them, but these were being used as pack animals to transport supplies, goods, food, and eventually booty as well. of course, very important. Now, there is actually a reference to Vikings fighting on horseback from the year 888 at the Battle of Montfaucon, which is fought in today's France and was fought between a Viking army and the Frankish army. And it describes that Count Odo of the Franks ended up killing around 10,000 mounted Vikings and 9,000 infantry. Now, no doubt these figures are hugely exaggerated. They would probably be a lot smaller if that's what they're talking about. The source is Abbo of Fleury, who lived after the battle had been fought, but potentially had reliable information on this, although there's not really much more to go on. So I thought I'd present it here as one of the examples of potentially the Vikings fighting on horseback. Why they would have done that isn't exactly clear. Perhaps they were caught while they were on the move and were therefore on horseback. That's a possibility. Or maybe they were indeed trying something new, and this is an example of the Vikings fighting on horseback. We're not entirely sure, but this is a reference that deserves to be added. Now, in the year 968, we also get a reference to Vikings fighting on horseback, and this is at the Battle of Sulcoit, which was in Ireland, and against Brian Boru, who would later, of course, become a famous High King. And in this case, it does seem rather likely that what occurred is that the Vikings were caught while they were on the move, and that's why they were on horseback, and then they were fighting against the Irish. At the same time, however, the main source for the battle as we have it today is from the Cogath Goidler Agathluth, which is an Irish source from around a century and a half after the battle was fought, and it's heavily propagandized. We know that Brian Boru was an expert at using light cavalry to strike against his enemies, so it's possible that the author of the Cogath was really just inferring that because his protagonist had cavalry, that the antagonists, so the Vikings, must also have had cavalry. Well, a third option is that we know that the Vikings of Limerick, who were at the Battle of Sulcoit, also had Irish mercenaries or local Irish allies, so it's possible that these were the ones actually on horseback. So there's a few possibilities there. Possibly we're talking about Vikings on horseback again, but not necessarily. Now, we also have some evidence from 1066, and this is from the Battle of Stamford Bridge, as it's described in Heimskringla, which is an early 13th century source describing a mid-11th century battle. And during this battle, the Anglo-Saxon English were fighting against the invading Norwegian army of Harald Hardrada. Now, what's interesting is that there's a quote that survives from Heimskringla. Again, not sure if this is an actual quote or if this is Snorri simply making an interesting story. But it says, "The king said, 'We shall do something else. Put our fastest horses under 3 bold fellows, let them ride as fast as they can, and tell the Norwegians of the danger. They will come straight away to help us. The English must sooner expect more fight from us than flight, and we shall fight bitterly a good time before we acknowledge we are beaten.'" Indeed, this doesn't sound like it's an actual quote from the period. It sounds more like interesting storytelling, and because Snorri was writing in the early 13th century, of course, at that time, feudal warfare was the main type of warfare. Heavy cavalry, the knight, were dominant in Europe and indeed in a lot of the romantic literature that he would have been reading. Even on Iceland, a lot of the French stuff was popular. And so likely this is actually him inferring into the past the warfare of the present day. However, it may be possible that the Norwegians had brought some horses with them. This was a large fleet rather than a simple raiding crew. Or that indeed they had been in York for some time. These were more likely than not, if there were horses being used there, they were local horses. So it does suggest they had horses with them, although accounts of horses being used in the battle by the English, as I talked about in my other video on Anglo-Saxon horses, are most likely fictitious and back projections from their own time, because the other accounts of the battles, like in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, do not mention any horses, and the famous stories from the battle that have survived also don't really lend themselves to cavalry being used. So we've talked now about the use of mounted warriors on Viking expeditions abroad, both in Britain and Ireland and on the continent against the Franks. But what about back home in Scandinavia? Because of course then the argument that, well, it's rather inconvenient to bring horses over to another place and then to start fighting on them doesn't really hold up. Well, Scandinavia isn't the best place to create a kind of martial equine culture as some other places around the world have been. For example, there are a lot of mountains and thick forests, not to mention lots of swamps across much of Scandinavia. And even the breed of horse that was around at the start of the Viking Age in Scandinavia was fitted to that kind of environment. They were hardy, small beasts. They weren't the best to be riding on. Think of the Icelandic horse today, and you're probably not too far off the mark for what horses look like in Scandinavia. They were good for pulling, they could be out in the climate for a lot of the year, but in terms of creating a kind of destrier like a later knight would ride, this wasn't the kind of animal you wanted. However, it's possible that towards the start of the Viking Age there was some importation and breeding of horses from the continent. For example, like the Frisian breed would be brought over and mixed with local breeds to create stronger, sturdier horses which are better for fighting on. And as such, we do have some references to cavalry being used in Denmark and by Danish kings. For example, in 804, we read in the Frankish royal Annals that Eorem tempore Godofridus rex Danorum venit cum classe sua necnon et omni equitatu regni sui ad locum, qui dicitur Sleistorp in confinio regni sui et Saxonii. And this translates to, at this point, Godfred, king of the Danes, came with a fleet and with all the cavalry of his kingdom to Schleswig on the Danish-Saxon border. This is one of the many conflicts fought between Godfred and the Frankish emperor Charlemagne. A very interesting conflict to be sure. But this translation that cavalry is mentioned depends very much on how we translate equitatu, and some have translated this as cavalry, but other scholars would see it more like saying the chiefs on horses or chiefs with horses, rather than necessarily being soldiers fighting on horseback. And as we've already mentioned, it was customary among both the Anglo-Saxons and indeed among the Norse to often be able to ride horses to battle, but then to dismount, or at least that is the taken, often traditional opinion on their fighting. Now, it does make sense that there would be some kind of cavalry, particularly in southern Denmark, in southern Jutland, because this is the most open area of all of Scandinavia. It's, of course, the bit that's now German, used to be Denmark before the Prussians nabbed it. And so there is some kind of evidence that there was a bit of an equine or cavalry culture developing there, just as there was in the Saxony to the south, and then, of course, across in the Frankish lands as well. And we can actually read in the Viking World, in a chapter by Johan Kalmar, that the mounted warrior already appears in the Merovingian period, if not earlier, but only slowly becomes important. There is much to suggest that mounted troops copying Carolingian standards were organised in southern Jutland already in the late 8th century. Occasional finds show us that these impulses also reached other parts of Scandinavia, such as Norway. These changes in armaments most likely equaled changes in fighting technique and military culture in general. The cavalry of the Jutish kings may, however, have become disorganized as the royal power disintegrated in the second half of the 9th century. This is particularly interesting because it does suggest that there may have been some kind of cavalry element in this southern part of Denmark. And because this southern part of Denmark is exactly where King Godfred was operating, and we know that he, for example, defended the Danevirke, this great series of fortifications, then it's quite possible that he had under his command some of these early attempts at cavalry that we see in Scandinavia. And actually, around a century and a half later, we get the rule of Harald Gormson, who's mostly referred to as Harold Bluetooth, and often perhaps erroneously referred to as the first king of a united Denmark. And we may have some evidence for cavalry being used in his reign as well. It's thought that during his reign there was some more emphasis on the use of cavalry, or indeed an introduction or reintroduction of the use of cavalry, importing continental horse breeds and breeding them with Scandinavian stock, as well as the fact that there are quite a few cavalry graves found around Jelling, the site of Jelling being, of course, where the famous Jelling stone was also erected and is most likely the nucleus of his power in Denmark at that time. But it's also possible that he was using cavalry to fight against the Frankish incursions into Denmark when he fought them at the Danevirke. But again, real cast iron evidence for a separate cavalry contingent that fought independently from the infantry there is not. And in fact, the first time we hear about Scandinavia there being heavy cavalry deployed to fight on its own is in 1134, so quite a bit after the Viking Age, and even then it's with hired German mercenaries rather than with native Scandinavians, which possibly tells you something about the native Scandinavian tradition of fighting and how these things endured even after the Viking Age. Although after this point it's quite clear that it was no longer richer peasants sending their sons to fight in noble retinues on foot, but that there was a clear class distinction where the higher classes were mounted and on horseback and indeed fighting thusly. The closest definite evidence we then get of Vikings or the Norse on horseback must be with the Normans. Now, the Normans, of course, were given the Duchy of Normandy in 911, and when they arrived, they were the quintessential Norwegian, what many of us today would describe as Vikings. Though fairly soon, this culture blended with that of the local inhabitants, the Frankish peoples there, and created something entirely different. Well, it wasn't different, it was familiar to both. It was a hybrid culture that became the Normans. Now, the development, of course, that the Franks had already got a heavy cavalry element in most of their armies. But the Norman cavalry fought in a slightly different way to the Franks. And it's very interesting to question, where did the Norman equine mastery come from? Did it all come from the Frankish side? Was it something hidden in the Norse side that was added in? We don't necessarily know. Or was it something completely different and organic that arose there, and why there? We're not entirely sure, and that is also beyond the scope of this video, but very interesting to ponder. Needless to say, this was something very different to what their ancestors in Norway had been doing beforehand. We don't get massed cavalry charges of the Vikings. And if those accounts of the Vikings fighting on horseback in Ireland and Francia are to be taken at face value, we can imagine that they would be fighting in a rather different style to the Norman cavalry charge. And even the Normans aren't necessarily the most cavalry-oriented people as we might imagine them today. A lot of the time we will today be talking about Norman knights, whereas in the Latin they would describe their cavalrymen as milite, which probably is the English cavalier or something similar, while their foot soldiers were described as pedite, the infantry, or literally foot men, foot soldiers. Now, what's interesting is that the distinction between these two classes isn't always cast iron, and actually a lot of the time the Norman cavalry would dismount to then fight on foot against their foe, although they of course did have the heavy cavalry charge that we now know them for. Perhaps harking back a little bit to how their Norse ancestors would have done the same. But the discussion of Norman cavalry is definitely something for another video. For now, this has been the video on the Vikings and whether or not they used cavalry, and if so, in which instances. Let me know, did you think that I've missed something in this video? Would you draw other conclusions about the use or lack of use of Viking cavalry and the reasons why? Then I would love to hear it. Let me know in the comments section below. And if you did indeed happen to enjoy this video and would like to see more in this area of history, give me a thumbs up, and if you're new, subscribe, because that really helps me out, boosts the video in the algorithm so like-minded people can find my content, and it also just lets me know that actually a lot of you find this kind of thing interesting and that I should make more about it. So do let me know what you thought in the comments below. Check out any other videos I might have on similar topics, and until the next time, I have been Hilbert and this has been The History.